Good morning and welcome. My name is Madeline Yates. I am with Campus Compact Mid-Atlantic, and I'm very happy to be hosting this conversation this morning with the Middle States Commission for Higher Education, Campus Compact of New York and Pennsylvania, and Campus Compact of New Jersey. We are focused today on the intersection of the Carnegie Foundation's community engagement classification application and how it can support the self-study and accreditation with Middle State. So thank you for joining us. We're very pleased to have representatives from over 100 institutions, but in the series itself from nearly half of the institutions that are accredited through Middle States from a dozen countries and couple dozen states and nearly 250 institutions. So please use the Q&A function during the webinar. You'll also notice that you have closed captioning at the bottom of your screens if you need that. And on behalf of our board and planning committee, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our guest speakers today. First, Dr. Robert Bonfiglio is the Vice President and Institutional Field Relations over institutional field relations with Middle States. Then Dr. Matthew Johnson, President of Albion College, and importantly, the Director of the Community Engagement Classification with the Carnegie Foundation. Dr. Lynn Okagaki is the Deputy Provost of Academic Affairs at the University of Delaware, and Dr. Lynette Overby, Deputy Director of University Community Engagement Initiative at the University of Delaware. We also have, fortunately, Ms. Linda Lanou, who is a colleague of Dr. Johnson's, recently appointed to assist with the community engagement classification. And finally, my colleague, Lori Worrell, Executive Director of Campus Compact New York, Pennsylvania. The context of our work could never be more important. What is going on in our country, in our world, is relevant to our institutions, to the learning that we want to take place with our students, and to higher education's public purposes and social responsibility to be partners with our communities in improving community life. So with that, I will turn it over to Bob to tell us why this conversation is important to Middle States, and particularly the intersection with the Carnegie Foundation and the engagement classification.
Thank you, Madeline, and good morning. On behalf of Middle States, we'd like to extend the appreciation to the Mid-Atlantic Campus Compact, the New York, Pennsylvania Campus Compact, and the New Jersey Campus Compact for their leadership in organizing these conversations, which I asked Madeline before. Over 1,000 people have participated in these conversations, so obviously they have struck a chord, and it's been great collaborating with the Campus Compact folks. Madeline mentioned the word relevance and the importance of this, the work of civic and community engagement in these times, and I would also say the theme of this particular conversation is relevance. Relevance between the Carnegie classification for civic engagement and the Middle States accreditation process. What I'd like to do in the few minutes I've been allotted is to review a little bit what's involved in accreditation and then try to make that connection to the Carnegie classification. So this presentation, this conversation is entitled, in the title of this presentation, we speak to three processes: self-study, accreditation, and the Carnegie Civic Engagement Classification. Let's define our terms. Accreditation is about the periodic review of the quality of higher education institutions. And that is done in order to tell the good news to students, families, government officials, and the public at large that institutions are operating at a high level of quality. And that judgment is based upon mutually agreed upon standards of performance, standards of quality, compliance, and accreditation. And self-study is a precursor to the accreditation process. How do we think about the self-study? In Middle States, we say a self-study requires an institution to engage in an in-depth, comprehensive, and reflective assessment process to assess the institution's quality and success in meeting its mission, and to identify institutional priorities and other opportunities for innovation and improvement. And that process is based on 7 standards for accreditation, 15 requirements of affiliation, and applicable federal regulations. So the point of self-study is to strengthen an institution and to communicate to the public that your institution is an institution of quality, and also that your institution is committed to the idea of continuous improvement. The third of these processes, accreditation and self-study, the third process we're speaking of today is the Carnegie classification. And the Carnegie Civic Engagement Classification was established as a way that higher education institutions could engage in a process of inquiry, reflection, and self-assessment about their work in civic engagement. And it also respects the diversity of institutions and approaches to community engagement. It recognizes the achievements of institutions, but also spurs them to improve. So encouraging improvement through inquiry, through reflection, through self-assessment. This is the way the Carnegie classification works, and this is the way the Middle States accreditation works. Basically one and the same process. You would think that this is self-evident, that these things are so compatible. I'd like to drive the point home and offer a few brief examples in order to underscore the similarities between these processes. First, both these processes rely on the collection and analysis of evidence on an institutional specific basis. The Middle States self-study requires the submission of an evidence inventory, and the Carnegie classification application similarly includes a documentation framework. Secondly, these reflections, these inquiries take place in the context of individual institutional missions rather than a singular prescribed mission. The first Middle States standard for accreditation is entitled Mission and Goals, and the very first question on the Carnegie classification documentation framework is, does your institution indicate that community engagement is a priority in its mission statement? So these are mission-based activities. In addition, these are comprehensive inquiries. The Carnegie classification can be obtained if the institution in total is deemed to demonstrate a commitment to civic and community engagement. And Middle States accreditation is offered when in total it is deemed that the institution is offering programs, services, and processes of quality. I would point out that neither the Carnegie classification nor Middle States accreditation results in a ranking or numerical indicator. Rather, a declaration that an institution meets the standards for the classification or meets the standards of accreditation. Another similarity, as I said, both these processes are identified as catalysts for institutional change to try to better your work on a day-to-day basis. And these processes both insist upon rigor in the assessment of these activities. Ultimately, the successful completion of each process signals to the public that the institution can prove that it's actively fulfilling its commitment to the public good. Because of these commonalities, I can't imagine any institution being able to demonstrate its qualification for the Carnegie classification and not being able to demonstrate its commitment to the standards when it comes to items related to community and civic engagement. And we at Middle States encourage you to use the evidence collected during the Carnegie Civic Engagement Classification application process during your accreditation study. You may even consider exploring your institution's commitment to civic and community engagement by declaring it as one of the priorities required of the self-study. This is in fact is what one of the institutions I'm working with right now has decided to do. One of the three it identified for its focused analysis was to incorporate the importance of community responsibility in the experiences of all its students. As is stated in a self-study design, which is the institutional blueprint for the self-study, the institution seeks to be steadfast in its dedication to maintaining an educational environment that instills a personal commitment to service, human rights, and social justice, thus fostering a sense of civic engagement both during and after enrollment. At this moment, I cannot think of a better example of the synchronicity between the self-study and the accreditation and the Carnegie Civic Engagement Classification application process. It's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Matthew Johnson, who is the president of Albion College and also the director of the Community Engagement Classification for the Carnegie Foundation. Dr. Johnson.
The mute. Thank you, Dr. Montiglio. The mute got me. It is part of the pandemic symptomology, I think. It's a pleasure to be here today. I should start by saying that I'm in a public place on the road today, so if the background noise becomes something, someone please let me know. I'm in community, and that's what the classification is about. It's about being in community. But from my perspective, that's what the compact is about too. In fact, as I started my career as a freshly minted PhD, new faculty member in Northern Maine, and started engaging with the Native American population outside of the campus at which I lived and worked, it was Campus Compact who tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Hey, what you're doing is called community engagement. We can help you do it better." And I was hooked. And so across my career, I have been deeply involved in the compact, whether it be in New York with Lori Worrell, who you hear from a bit later, or with the other directors I've known in West Virginia and Maine and elsewhere. And I've been fortunate enough to have been asked a few years ago to take on leadership of the community engagement classification. The classification is in some ways a corrective to the basic classification system. The basic classification system is a system we all know. It's the system that says we are either a Research 1 or a regional comprehensive, a national liberal arts, or some other type of institution. And when it was initially designed, it was designed as a mechanism to differentiate types of institutions. It was not meant to be a status hierarchy, which is what it has become for many institutions. So in 2015, the foundation decided to start a process of designing additional classifications that were really focused more on type of institution. And the first one they built was the community engagement classification, because they recognized that community engagement was one way that institutions could make a commitment to express their public purpose. Since then, we have built a new classification on leadership for public purpose, and we are in the process of building a third classification for racial equity in higher education. We imagine additional classifications for sustainability and a variety of other elements in the future. The classification is hinged on a definition of engagement that is particular to the foundation. And the definition is important in part because community engagement is such a common colloquial phrase we use in higher education. So I want to start with making sure that we understand the definition. For the foundation, the definition of community engagement is really about the exchange of knowledge that comes from both inside and outside the academy, within the framework of reciprocal partnerships between academics and non-academics. And that exchange has an impact on the pedagogical approach and the research enterprise of the institution. So both the community and the institution are transformed from the exchange. This is really important for the applicants to understand, because it's not community service, it's not community participation, or even community service. I'm just moving out of the sound a little bit here. Hopefully that's better. It is mutual reciprocal exchange of knowledge that is the core of the community engagement. So how do we demonstrate that as an institution? Well, the classification is broken up into several sections. The first is foundational sections, and that asks about mission. It asks about the way our leaders of our institutions talk about community engagement, if indeed they do. It asks about the communication style of the institution and its marketing messages. And it asks about things like budget allocations and infrastructure for community engagement. We are looking in the classification for a depth and pervasiveness of community engagement throughout the life of the institution. In much the same way that the accreditation standards are looking across the institution at how the institution is aligning all of its practices with its stated mission. Here, we are focusing on the stated mission of community engagement. So depth and pervasiveness of community engagement across the institution are important, and reviewers triangulate answers to questions across the application. We're also looking for processes and structures to make sure the processes and structures of the institution have appropriately institutionalized community engagement as a practice. That the institutional processes and structures are able to control for quality of community engagement. Sorry, traffic. Welcome to the Zoom world. We also are looking for continuous improvement at all levels and across all functions. Does the institution collect documentation with regard to community engagement? Does it track community engagement? If so, how? And does it assess community engagement? Does it measure, for example, perceptions of partnerships? Does it measure the voice or account for the voice of partners? Does it measure quality of partnership or the process of partnership? But we're also interested in understanding if the institution is measuring learning or impact of community engagement on students, on faculty, on staff, on partners, and on the institution. Finally, we are very concerned about the institution's ability to demonstrate that it has the sufficient resources and policies to support high quality community engagement. And in this way, we basically cover all of the standards of Middle States. So in conclusion then, if you have succeeded at being a community engaged classified institution, you have much of the evidence you need to answer significant portions of each of the standards of Middle States.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Lynette Overby and I are going to talk briefly about our experience using the University of Delaware's Carnegie application to inform the university's Middle States Self-Study Report and the parallels that we saw in the process for preparing the Middle States Self-Study Report and the application for the Carnegie Community Engagement Classification. So I'm Lynn Okagaki, and I co-chair our university's Middle States Self-Study Committee. The first point that I want to make is that, so next slide, thank you, is that when you are preparing the Middle States Self-Study Report, you cannot rely on only one lens as you address the standards. Even though we're talking about how the Carnegie Community Engagement Application can help address the Middle States standards, when you're working on the Middle States Self-Study, you have to have multiple voices at the table and have multiple opportunities for input from the larger community. The self-study is a comprehensive look at what the university is doing, and it requires you to gather input broadly. And we have found, I'm sure like others, that people can have very different views of the institution, what it is doing, and how well it is doing it. I'm going to turn it over to Lynette, who led our effort to prepare the Carnegie Community Engagement application now.
Thank you, Lynn. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. So our community engagement application process provided us with the opportunity to document and reflect on the engagement occurring on our campus and to begin making plans for improvement of our community engagement efforts by developing structures and processes that would benefit the students, faculty, alumni, and community partners in the future. Individuals representing all aspects of the university were involved in this process.
One of the parallels between the Middle States standards and the Carnegie Community Engagement Classification criteria is the focus on the institution's mission. In Middle States Standard 1B, we are asked if we have a clearly defined mission and goals that address external as well as internal contexts and constituencies. And under the foundational indicators for the Carnegie application, we're asked if the institution indicates that community engagement is a priority in its mission statement. As a land-grant institution, engagement with our local community, the nation, and the global community is part of our DNA. Part of this engagement certainly is explicitly focused on serving our communities by applying our research and creativity to address the challenges facing communities in Delaware and around the world. But we are also enriched through our partnerships with individuals and entities within these communities. And Lynette is going to describe one of our partnership initiatives.
Yes, so as a result of our designation as an engaged university, we established a community engagement initiative as a structure to organize many aspects of community engagement on campus. And one development of CEI was the creation of mutually beneficial partnerships. And these partnerships focused on arts and culture, education, health, and also we had place-based partnerships in Wilmington and Newark. And I'm going to share some information about the partnership for arts and culture as just one example. So you can see on this slide that this was one of the goals of PAC, as we call it, to promote the engagement of the arts and cultural disciplines in the designing, implementing, and assessing multidisciplinary solutions to social issues and leading to global understanding and social change. And so to do that, we had visioning sessions. We wanted to make sure we collaborated with the community partners. And so this was an example of a visioning session where we had framing questions that would allow us to align the goals of our university with the needs of the community. This is a picture of the visioning session. In each one of those pictures, we see community partners who are from the arts and culture section, from museums, as well as arts producing agencies and university faculty working along with them. And so then we were able to consider ways of presenting grants that were going to be mutually beneficial. And you know, as was stated about when we think about community engagement, it's not just service or volunteering, but this mutually beneficial reciprocity that each individual who works in collaboration has to have. So these are some examples. John Cox, who worked with the Lenni Lenape Indian tribe of Delaware, continues doing that work. This was a 2019 PAC, and he's received grants to continue that work. Roger Horowitz, who has interviewed individuals from the Jewish Historical Society, and students have worked with him to look at those interviews and to house them in our library. Stephanie Rabel, who's with entrepreneurship and worked with Delaware High School students, and Martha Carruthers, who developed, along with elementary school teachers and science faculty, storybooks that are now distributed in many schools in the state.
As another example of how our Carnegie application informed our middle state self-study, we have Standard 1, Criterion 3, which addresses goals that focus on student learning and are consistent with the institutional mission. The Carnegie application also examines learning outcomes for students' curricular engagement with the community. In our general education goals, we commit to preparing students to be engaged students who are involved in the world around them. Opportunities for experiential learning are woven into the curriculum. Over 70% of our seniors indicate that they participated in an internship, field experience, or clinical placement in which they learn effective actions, alternatives, and solutions to situations and/or problems that occur in real-life contexts. Lynette will describe some of the evidence garnered in our Carnegie application that addressed the ways in which assessment data related to learning outcomes for students' curricular engagement with the community and how the data were used. And these are examples that helped us as we worked on our middle state self-study.
So one example is our hospitality and sport business management program that prepares students to work in an industry in which they will lead a diverse group of people. The department requires community engagement, so the students develop the ability to work with diverse communities through 100 hours of service with community organizations. Through this experience, it is expected that students will gain an awareness of civic responsibility, learn to apply their own discipline to community service, develop strategies to access community needs, and effectively communicate knowledge and ideas in various economic situations. And this is an example. Nathan Benuitz worked this last summer with top-notch tennis tours. There was an article in our U-Daily about his work within that area. Another example is our plant and soil sciences program. And plant and soil sciences has designated SLOs for student engagement with the community that include the ability to evaluate sustainable practices related to preservation of the environment within their field of study and analyze the ways in which people, plants, and soils interact with the overall environment so as to promote the conservation of natural resources. And to meet these goals, students design experiments that have resulted in patented and licensed product development for global use that meet specific landowner and user goals. I also want to mention our Community Engagement Scholars course of study, because as was mentioned, when we do this work of looking, documenting, reflecting on the work we've done in community engagement, it helps us to plan for the future. And so after we received the classification and established our community engagement initiative, we began to develop programming that would support other aspects of the institution. And one is our Community Engagement Scholars course of study. Students as freshmen can become community engagement scholars and through their next 4 years, and they are mentored in how to apply their discipline to becoming an engaged scholar, hopefully throughout their life. We have over 100 students who were recently admitted into that program. So I guess in conclusion, Lynn and I have learned a great deal in the process of self-study required for middle states and the Carnegie classification. And because of this work, we are aware of the intersections of where the middle states documentation informs our community engagement work and vice versa. Together, both of these documentation strategies lead to more informed decisions making and more informed decision making and strategic planning. And this benefits our students, our faculty, our staff, our alumni, and our community partners. See, I think that concludes our presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing.
Wonderful, and thank you. Shall we turn it then to Dr. Lori Worrell, who will shepherd our Q&A?
Thanks, Madeline. Before I start with general questions, I had a question from the viewers, specifically to Dr. Overby and Ogakaka. I'm sorry, I'm just going to butcher your name. My apologies. Do you have a campus-wide system for tracking and assessing community engagement? And if you do, could you describe that system?
Yeah, so when we were preparing the Carnegie, we actually surveyed the faculty and determined what kind of community engagement they were involved in. And I think when we documented it for the classification, we had over 350 examples of community engagement that were documented. And then there is also a section for outreach and engagement partnerships where we selected, I think there are 15 that were exemplary. And then last year, Allison Carpin created another survey, and this one was for faculty, students, staff, and community partners, because one of the areas of concern, or when we receive the classification, they give you a letter saying, yeah, this is great, but you need to work on some other things, and community voice was one of those. So we were able to capture community voice in our most recent survey of community engagement.
Nice, thank you. And I'm going to put Matthew Johnson, Dr. Johnson, on the spot and ask you if you have come across any exemplary systems for campus-wide systems for tracking community or assessing community engagement.
I have, and I want to differentiate tracking from assessment for just a moment. Tracking is sort of the baseline of surfacing and being able to report on the activity that's taking place at your school. If you can't do that, it's hard to do anything beyond that in assessment or any other measurement. We measure what we think is important, and what gets measured gets resources. And so that's where we begin our thinking at the foundation. So a really good tracking system for student engagement is a platform called GivePulse. There are other platforms like it that allow for students to create and manage a portfolio of engagement. It also allows for surveying of partners and for partners to utilize the platform for themselves for their own management of engagement. There are other platforms, like a platform built by Memorial University in Newfoundland called YAFFLE, Y-A-F-F-L-E, which is a Newfoundland word. It means like a bunch, like you would go out and get a yaffle of firewood for the evening. YAFFLE is a system that allows an institution to document specific projects, all the players in the projects, and how those players relate to each other. So it's really a networking app that shows the networking connections across projects. But it also then provides the platform on which you can do assessment of the effectiveness and impact of those projects, and you can survey partners and you can survey participants, faculty, and students. A third platform that I'm less familiar with, but I know there are some schools that use, is called the Collaboratory, which is I believe a platform that is sort of a database structure, and perhaps others on the call know more about it, that parallels the structure of the Carnegie classification framework, so that when you get ready to apply, you've already collected all of that data in that database. So there's a variety of mechanisms for that. There is a research tool called the National Assessment for Service and Community Engagement, which is also effective at providing a tool for you to assess your student outcomes for community engagement.
Here, I'm sorry, I have a follow-up question that's for my own kind of experience. I'm curious if for both Dr. Johnson, Dr. Overby, and Dr. Ogakaki, Dr. Lin, what about substantive tracking, and I don't know about assessment, but tracking in terms of like annual faculty reviews or faculty self-reports. And if there's anything that is out there, or any institution out there doing a good job, well,
So this is actually a really good example of the difference between tracking and assessment. So most institutions have an annual faculty activity form that faculty have to fill out. Tracking would say, put a question in that asks the faculty member to report on any community engagement they've done. Now you've got a body of data that tells you where it's happening. You can then turn around and survey those faculty about the impacts of that engagement and start a conversation with them about year-over-year continuous improvement. Because the classification is really about continuous improvement, as the Middle States standards are. We want to see that you are tracking, assessing, and then using the insights you get from that assessment to make course corrections and improvement over time.
Do either Dr. Lynette or Dr. Lynn want to answer that or respond at all?
So one of the issues with community engagement is the fact that we want faculty to receive credit and value for this work. And so we are working to make this happen by working with our faculty senate. And this is what, it's an issue with many universities, right? It says how can we document this work so that it is valued as much as traditional work. And there are different ways that different universities have tried to do that, including, as was mentioned, indicate on your annual review form how the impact you've made when you go up for promotion and tenure, broadening who can provide information on impact. And so, yes, this is an area of concern, and actually it's under the foundational area for the Carnegie. What are you doing to make sure that faculty are valued for this work? So it's an ongoing work at many institutions, I would say.
Let me just add that when it is acknowledged as a legitimate pedagogical method, as a legitimate research methodology, and as a legitimate service modality, you create the avenues for faculty to be rewarded for it. And in higher ed, where we're working hard on diversity, institutions should understand that where they create these legitimate pathways, they will be more successful at securing tenure track faculty from historically underrepresented backgrounds, because those faculty are disproportionately interested in community engagement and will leave your institution or be washed out in the tenure process if there are not avenues to legitimately acknowledge and value community engaged work. But really, that is only the first rung that the foundation is looking for. The second rung, after it is acknowledged as a legitimate pathway, is to then ask what accommodations are needed when you are acknowledging the legitimacy of those pathways. For example, when you do community engaged teaching as a pedagogical practice, it's messy. So how do faculty evaluations need to look different? Faculty don't control all aspects of those classes. So how do you evaluate a faculty member as a teacher in those moments? Likewise, community engaged research is slow, it's intentional, it's deep. And sometimes the outcome is not in the control of the faculty member. That is, it's not publishable in the classic way. So an accommodation there might be to extend the tenure clock. Might also be to lighten the teaching load if a faculty member chooses a community engaged scholarly pathway. Finally, the third level, if you really want to go all the way into community engagement, is to ask who is a peer and what is dissemination. So for example, if I have a colleague who has spent her career doing research on the juvenile justice system of a particular state, and in so doing has transformed fundamentally the juvenile justice system of that state, but can't publish it because that research is under contract to the state, Is there any way that we can acknowledge and value that scholarship in her appeal for tenure? These are the questions that we need to ask, because at the heart of the definition of the classification is really epistemological complexity. The positionality that knowledge is created both within the institution and outside the institution, and that it takes a certain set of scholarly skills to combine those two different types of knowledge into the finished product, and that combination is longer, harder, and different than classic scholarship or classic pedagogy.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm reading the chat. There's a rather relatively complicated question regarding how institutions, and maybe specifically the institutions here, are beginning to assess student learning specific to issues of diversity, equity, inclusion. And I would connect that to, are there efforts to connect that to the community engagement experiences of students? I have a follow-up question regarding sort of the preparation of students for community engaged work, but let me stop right there.
Yeah, so I think we did ask a question in the 2020 cycle about alignment between an institution's diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda and their community engagement agenda. So we are looking for that alignment. And it is certainly the case that many institutions have built into their community engaged learning outcomes aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion as learning outcomes for their students. One caution I would offer, however, in terms of the classification, is that we often see unsuccessful institutions, that is, unsuccessful in achieving the classification. They may be very successful in other ways, substitute learning outcomes that are perhaps implicitly about community engagement, but may not be explicitly about community engagement. And so when that happens, a national reviewer is left to wonder if the learning outcome that is being assessed is really about community engagement. And so I would caution schools not to use proxy learning outcomes, that they might import from their diversity, equity, and inclusion work without an expressed, explicit piece of those learning outcomes being about community engagement.
Since the audience has brought up the issue of student learning and assessing student learning around diversity, equity, inclusion, I wonder if Dr. Bonfiglio, you might address anything that the Middle States Commission is thinking about in the future around how you even go about assessing that kind of teaching and learning from an institutional perspective. I'm sorry to put you on the spot, by the way. And please, you're on mute.
Thanks, Laurie. Our role at Middle States is not to direct institutions to conduct assessment in any particular way, but just to encourage them to ensure that what they're reporting in terms of institutional activity is backed up by their assessment data. And it's interesting to me that we've spent a good amount of time here talking about the assessment of this work. Probably President Johnson is too humble, but to say this, but he's edited a book called The Elective Carnegie Community Classification with John Saltmarsh. And in it, it says the data collection and evidence gathering process is one of the most important elements of the Carnegie classification, right? And we feel the same way at Middle States. Data collection, evidence collection, documentation of compliance with the standards is really one of the most important parts, if not the most important part of the accreditation process. Now, President Johnson mentioned 3 or 4 ways right off the bat he knows of how to both track and assess student engagement. in community activities. And there are myriad ways to assess. Again, at Middle States, we just want to make sure that that's happening in a way that best meets the needs of the institution.
Thank you. I apologize. Okay, so I have a specific question. Regarding the financial support for students who likely say are high financial need and need to work one or multiple jobs, and yet maybe it's important to the institution that the students engage in community work, and or it's important to the student that they engage in community work. And I'm going to toss that to Dr. Overby and Dr. Okakaki to answer that from your perspective, especially I think because Delaware, University of Delaware is both a land grant and a research, a high intensive research one institution. How would you answer that question?
I guess I can start and then I'll turn it over to Lynn. But yes, and in my former life, I was a faculty director for the undergraduate research program at the university. And now in my role with community engagement, it's all about the fact that students really want to do this work, but they also need to work, right? They need to have a way of making money in the summer, et cetera. And so we have a summer scholars program, and the students receive a nice stipend, and it is for community engagement. And this allows them, and we say you're really working full time doing this work as you are learning about applying community engagement. And that really goes across many disciplines and many colleges. And then I know there's also a work study program. Maybe Lynn can talk about that.
Yes, for undergraduate research, we have now created a program in which students are able to, work study students are able to have an undergraduate research assignment for their work study program. So faculty, and this is not for every faculty member, because this is not the typical student who you've identified to come work in your lab because they were an outstanding student in your class, and now you're taking on this mentorship role and bringing the student into your lab. This is, we're doing it, opening this to first and second year students for their work study assignment, because we want them to be able to have that undergraduate research experience. So we'd have to think about, it's going to depend on the work study rules. And we'd have to investigate that to see if we could actually extend that to community engagement experiences during the academic year. But that's something I think that would be a great thing for us, at least to explore.
Dr. Johnson, do you have anything to add, or Dr. Bunker?
Yeah, I would add a model that is probably the Cadillac version of this, the Bonner model. Bonner Foundation, BONNER.org. It's a really great model for how to support these types of students. What we're really talking about here is opportunity cost, right? That a low-income student choosing to do community engagement suffers an enormous opportunity cost that a middle class or above student doesn't. That they're choosing often between doing a summer job that contributes to their family income, not only paying for their own education, or doing community engagement. And so we do have a responsibility to figure out how to fund that for those students. The federal work study budget is a good budget at your institution to figure out how to maximize. Oftentimes you can leverage that budget through the community match mechanism that it affords and extend how many dollars your institution has to be able to place students in the community, in community engaged positions. And, you know, I've also found in my own work, it's a pretty rewarding piece for a donor to contribute to, because many donors see community engagement as a sort of give back, a sort of pay it forward. And so it doesn't feel so much like a give, like a hand out in financial aid. It feels like a step up, because they see that students are giving in their community engagement as well. It's sort of a double bottom line for a donor: help the institution, help the student, help the community, triple bottom line in that way. So that's a good mechanism to use.
And, you know, and I would add from my own experience, been a few years, but it is that kind of supporting student community engagement at just about any institution is an excellent way to engage new donors, new alum that have just graduated. I have worked at an institution where we had promised to raise, to match a gift, $75,000 in new money, brand new dollars, over the course of 5 years. And by going out in our annual appeal to new alums with this ask, to support student community engagement in whatever form, we raised $125,000 in brand new dollars just that first year. We had a 5-year period. And I heard from many young alum that it was the best ask that they had received. And much of those dollars were in $5, $10, $20, $25 gifts. So if you're thinking about a really authentic, mission-driven way to engage your young alums, it's quite an inspiring way to do that, personally speaking. Let's see here now. We've got another one.
I also have one other comment. One of our member institutions in the Mid-Atlantic region, I think, is up to about 28% of their federal work study dollars going to benefit the larger community. And they consider that a real equity issue, because access to high quality, transformative civic and community engagement opportunities is an equity issue. And frankly, then you can get into the cascading issue with K-12, because access at the K-12 level is both college readiness, career readiness, and long-term civic and community readiness. So it's exciting when colleges get into K-12 partnerships that really build out not a service to, but a with and by the younger youth on their path to civic and community engagement.
We have about
one caution I just want to offer in that regard to Madeline's comment is there is a slow sort of narrative emerging among this generation that goes something like this, that it should not only and always be the job of underrepresented students to do the community engagement to correct the inequities in schools where other students from historically marginalized backgrounds need the additional support, because that creates a system where the historically underrepresented student doesn't get to do the internship at Smith Barney, or doesn't get to do the research opportunity at a national laboratory, because the expectation is that they're gonna mentor and tutor kids like them in the urban or rural school who needs the mentoring, and so therefore they're going to be the student who does the community engagement. It's not to critique anything. It's just to say that it's another perspective we need to keep in mind as we're doing this work, because as one student said to me recently, the inequities in our system are set up to privilege certain groups, and maybe those are the groups that should be in the schools seeing how things are actually needed and happening, and so they will change policy. So it's just something to keep in mind.
Agreed. Well, we have about 6 minutes left. I wanted to give everybody a chance for some final comments or reflections. Does that sound fair, Madeline?
Oh, yes, absolutely. That's
Well,
where
let's
we
start
are in our webinar. Thank you.
Let's start with the folks at University of Delaware. Any just final thoughts or reflections on this overall topic and what we've been discussing today?
You know, I just want to say that the process itself is such a learning experience, and it's and when you can go into it and embrace it so that it's not seen as a chore, as something that you just check off, but that it's really an opportunity for an institution to take a serious look at itself and to think about how you want to grow and be better, that it becomes something that I think is meaningful for the participants who are really working on it, for the institution itself, and then personally. I mean, it's just, it becomes something that really is, it's an opportunity, not a chore.
Yeah, I would agree. I just was thinking about before we got the Carnegie classification to what we've been able to do since then. And I don't know if that would have been possible without the critique that we got from the Carnegie and without the university's support of how we could move forward. And so, yes, it takes time to do this type of self-study, but in the end, it's most beneficial to everyone.
Yeah, I agree. Dr. Johnson.
I mean, I would say this is what the power of accreditation is too. You know, when you go through your middle states process, you'll realize the same thing, that it's really about the process. There, of course, needs to be the acknowledgement at the end of the process that you are indeed a quality institution who receives accreditation, and in the Carnegie case, that you are indeed an institution that is worthy of being acknowledged as a community engaged institution. Nevertheless, even institutions who do not succeed at getting the classification often write to us or reach out to us and tell us how valuable the process was. And often will come back in the next round and easily achieve classification, because what they learned in the first round is what they were able to build a strategy around to be able to come back in the second round and be that much more successful. So the process is really what it's about. We have a saying we try and get campuses to think about: trust the process.
Thank you. And last but not least, Dr. Bonfilio.
Oh, Lori, I know you expected me to come up with something profound to say here at the end, but I really just want to make two very practical points. The first is that we've all heard the expression, no money, no mission. And the last few minutes talking about student opportunities for paid involvement reminded me that both the classification application and middle states have the expectation that institutional commitments are not only words, but are accompanied by institutional funding. And really, those are issues of institutional integrity from the middle states perspective. If you say you have this commitment needs to be evidenced in your planning processes, in your assessment processes, in your hiring, and yes, in your funding processes. And I think that is really critically important. And the second thing I wanted to say is that there are many roads to accreditation. And one of the things we do in middle states is fully respect the individual missions of our institutions and the individual ways they will document the fulfillment of their missions. The Carnegie classification tool is one tool people can use. I don't want people to leave with the impression, well, in order to get reaccredited, we need to apply for the Carnegie classification. What we are saying is, it's a helpful tool. There are other helpful tools out there. Get to know them and utilize the ones that work the best for your institution.
Madeline?
Thank you enormously. This is a marvelous conversation. I really credit the University of Delaware team for drilling into the similarities in the applications and sharing your stories. And Dr. Johnson and Dr. Bonfiglio, just a very valuable overlap and conversation. So we will have this as a recording on the Campus Compact Mid-Atlantic website. Our intent is to have an executive summary in written form to share with all of the participants on our webinar series, and then continue the conversation with all of you. Thank you very much.